the second part of hearing stream 6 on day 1. Our next natural landscapes in this evening. Goodness, okay,
Yes.
sorry, no, it's coastal environment. Sorry.
As well.
My apologies. Ahead of myself.
Does it do it?
Sure. Oh, is that something different? Has it changed at all?
It's got the A3 printouts.
Oh, yes.
A bit easier to find it. Righty. As I've already productive for the eco chapter, I'll skip over section 1 because it's basically the same things as previously, and jump straight into section 2, which is the overview of the coastal environment chapter.
Okay.
So the wide upper coastline, for context, extends 220 kilometres south of Ocean Beach to north of Matakona. The coastal environment is made up of 12 distinctive natural and modified areas, each containing specific characteristics and qualities. The coastal environment is highly valued by iwi. It has natural character, landscape, historic heritage, and biodiversity values. In addition, the coastal environment supports our recreational, pastoral farming, and scattered residential uses. Section 6A of the RMA directs councils to recognise and provide for the preservation of the natural character of the coastal environment, including the coastal marine area, wetlands, and lakes and rivers and their margins, and the protection of them from inappropriate subdivision, use, and development as a matter of national importance. The New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, or NZCPS, requires a strategic approach to managing development on the coast. The Wellington RPS, Change 1, contains directions related to the coastal environment as they align with and give effect to the NZCPS and the RMA. Coastal Environment Chapter seeks to manage subdivision, land use and development within the coastal area in accordance with the requirements of the NZCPS and the Wellington RPS. The Coastal Environment Chapter is a district-wide chapter, meaning it applies in addition to the underlying zones. In total, there are 4 planned map overlays and 2 schedules that give effect to the provisions of the Coastal Environment Chapter, which are the Coastal Environment Overlay on the maps, Schedule 9, Outstanding Natural Character Areas and the associated map overlay, Schedule 10, High and Very High Natural Character Areas and the map overlay, and the Foreshore Protection Area, which provides a setback for development from potential coastal hazards, and it has a dual purpose of protecting the natural character and ecology of the foreshore from adverse effects of development. An overview about how the provisions and map overlays of the chapter is included in Appendix 2. Shall I quickly go over that one?
Yeah.
Cool. So what I've set out in Appendix 2 is largely in effect what provisions of the chapter give effect to what objectives and policies of both the NZCPS and the Wellington RPS.
On page 13.
Yes. So that's just to help everyone link to what we're looking at for each provision. In terms of the way that subdivision use and development in the coastal environment is managed, we have 6 rules, well, 5 now, that manage earthworks or buildings and structures in the coastal environment, earthworks, vegetation modification, and buildings and structures within very high and high natural character areas, and the same activities within areas of outstanding natural character, We have a separate standalone rule for plantation forestry. And we have a particular rule for new residential activity within the foreshore protection area, which, as mentioned, is the hazards and ecology sort of overlay. And we've deleted rule R6 and incorporated that into R2 and R3. The standards of the coastal environment chapter manage earthworks, modification of indigenous vegetation and buildings and structures. It limits these activities to the thresholds required to protect the values of the coastal environment. And these standards are linked back through to the rules R1, R2, R3.
I've got a couple of questions, just mechanical ones.
Sure.
Can we go back to the operative plan? How is the coastal environment dealt with in there?
Let me just quickly refer back. So compared to the operative plan, the main changes are the introduction of an outstanding natural character overlay and the very high and high natural character overlays. This is in accordance with the policies of the New Zealand CPS, which it was policies 13 of the NZCPS.
Tells me what the what does the plan contain by way of provisions relating to the coastal environment? Spatially, how is it identified?
Spatially, yes, it is identified. Although the mapping has been updated, which Ms. McRae will cover in her evidence as to how that's been done.
So in the operative plan, is there a zone or is there a coastal overlay? What's the terminology?
Yes, is coastal environment management area?
Coastal environment.
CMA.
Coastal environment.
Yeah.
Coastal environment management area was in the operative plan.
Right, yes.
Well, that's my question. What's in the operative plan?
Yeah. Which
coastal environment management area.
Yeah, which has generally been updated and
yes.
Now
Is that a line on the plan?
Yes, it's a line inward of the coastal.
So, okay, well, what I'm trying to ascertain is these new proposed provisions are largely overlays that are mapped provisions from the schedules. What in the operative plan, what is the coastal environment management area an overlay or a zone?
It's an overlay.
Overlay. It was obviously produced before the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement came into force.
Yes, I believe it was.
2010 here. Okay.
I think it was produced, the mapping that did that was under the previous coastal policy statement, I think from 2002.
Yes.
The older version of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And generally, is it a bespoke line or is it a setback from the coast or marine area?
Very bespoke. I can explain that.
In the operative plan.
Oh, in the
Sorry, about, I just
yeah.
trying to ascertain that the baseline from the operative plan.
Yes, it was. Again, very bespoke. It's bespoke in both plans, but I think it was in terms of what was being looked at back in 2002. It was, I guess, the thresholds were different, perhaps, shall we say?
Okay. And now moving to the proposed plan, we've got the new coastal environment overlay, which again is mapped plan. And we've got these outstanding natural character areas and high and very high natural character areas. Are they all within the coastal overlay or do they extend beyond the coastal overlay?
Not all within the coastal.
Okay. So essentially the coastal overlay is divided into areas of significance, if you like, high, very high or outstanding.
Yeah. I mean, I'll get into it a little bit more in the evidence, but essentially the process is mapping the inland extent of the coastal environment and then within that identifying the areas that have high or very high or outstanding natural character.
And there's no other category, is there? The land within the coastal extent is either one of those three.
It's either these identified areas that are high, very high or outstanding natural character, or otherwise it's just in the coastal environment, and then it's only where those policies apply where it talks about being in the coastal environment. But the policies, the specific policies are to do with those areas that are high, very high or outstanding natural character.
Okay. And what happens where there's an intersection of overlays such as SNAs or because of landscapes within the coastal environment? How does that operate?
If 2 overlays or more apply to a particular area, you'd look at the chapters and rules for both overlays and apply them both.
So you may need consents. You may need consents under one, but not under the other, vice versa, or you may need consents under all the overlay provisions.
Potentially, yes.
Okay. Okay. And the foreshore protection area, is this a new concept? Did it have any equivalent in the operative plan?
Yes, I believe that has been relatively rolled over as is from the operative plan.
What was it called that in the operative
I
plan?
believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, was that bespoke mapped, or was it more of a blunt setback?
It's quite precautionary because there is very little specific coastal hazard mapping for the Wairopa coast. I think there's one specific coastal hazard mapping near Riversdale where it is
Yes.
kind of customised to that assessment, but the rest is very much a precautionary approach. So it's
Yes. Did it involve a setback from the coastline, a specified metric?
I think it's about 50 metres or so, but I can't recall off the top of my head.
If you could confirm that with, but the new foreshore protection area, do you say that's largely a rollover of that, or is it being mapped in a more bespoke manner?
No, it's largely a rollover.
And you said it as both a hazard and an ecological function.
Yes. So yes, it is a precautionary hazard setback, but also because those first 50 or so metres of the coastal environment are often very ecologically sensitive as well.
Okay.
It does has a dual purpose.
Okay, good to know. Thank you. That was just some mechanical questions for my benefit. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just ask a couple of points about P4 and P5? Our subdivision rules sort of cover the whole gambit there. But I'm really interested, obviously the demand for out on the coast is not going to diminish, it's going to keep growing. What is our subdivision rules? It'll force people to think inside the square. What is to stop landowners leasing sections for 99-year leases or whatever? It has the same effect as a subdivision, but without the subdivision, so it won't trigger these rules.
Probably nothing, because that'll be rules that sit outside the district plan.
Okay, so yeah, so effectively this plan is effectively saying you can't subdivide, but nothing's going to stop you leasing, or so the effect is exactly the same, of course.
Yes, I'm not familiar with the way that those work, but yes, since it's outside the district plan doesn't manage it.
The entire city of London is built on that premise.
Yes.
So, so
Well, with the exception that subdivision is defined to include leases over a certain period. They used to be 35 years. So you can't have an indefinite lease without incurring a subdivision rule.
Clarify that.
Has it changed from 35 or?
Still 35. So
Yeah.
if someone wants to lease a piece of land for more than 35 years, then it's classified as subdivision under the RMA.
okay, so but thinking outside the box, there's nothing for me saying I'm going to lease this for 34 years with a right of renewal every 34 years. So the effect is still the same.
Yeah.
So that's the point, because people will head down that line, because obviously the demand for these coastal properties are still going to be there.
Including renewal.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Including renewals.
Including renewal. Okay. Right.
Thank you.
I've already worked out how to work around that one. So,
Okay, let's move along. We are time constrained.
No matter how watertight you try to make a plan, there'd always be someone who finds a loophole.
exactly. So
There's always one somewhere. They're returning back to paragraph 9 in terms of changes compared to the operative district plan. So we've got the introduction of those natural character overlays as mentioned. We've updated the effects basis standards that limit earthworks, vegetation clearance, and structures in the coastal environment. There's provision for appropriate activities in the coastal environment, which includes customary conservation activities and key infrastructure that needs to be located there. And we've strengthened the provisions relating to the foreshore protection area, requiring avoidance of new development that increases coastal hazard exposure and risk. As a quick side note, the NZCPS also requires managing Indigenous biodiversity, natural features and landscapes, and public access as they relate to the coastal environment specifically. However, the national planning standards require that these issues be split into their own separate chapters. So these issues are managed by the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity, the natural features and landscapes, and the public access chapters respectively. Onto section 3, a total of 24 submissions and 15 further submissions were received on the coastal environment. Some submitters sought provisions to be more restrictive of development to protect the characteristics and values of the coastal environment. Other submitters sought the provisions to be more permissive to enable landowners and developers to better use their land. Submitters also sought the provisions be amended to give better effect to their interpretations of the NZCPS as a whole, rather than splitting some matters into separate chapters, for example, as I mentioned before, Indigenous biodiversity, landscape, etc.
So, so the submitters are seeking for something that is contrary to the direction of the NZCPS.
So the NZCPS, since it manages all those different values as well, and we've split them into separate chapters, they're seeking that it be reincorporated into the coastal environment chapter and that it be managed as a whole within the one chapter rather than split into the separate ones.
National planning standards
Yes.
direct that they are managed through the separate chapters.
Yes, and the line can be a bit grey as to where that line is. So there is some interpretation there as well.
Okay. Thank you.
On to section 4, I've read the evidence of Lucy McWilliam on behalf of Addison Shaw, Deborah Donaldson on behalf of Brian McGuinness, Christina Schipper on behalf of the Director General of Conservation, Christine Foster and John Hudson on behalf of Eastleigh. E should just be Christine Foster on behalf of Meridian Energy, and Ansley McLeod on behalf of Transpower. Firstly, on to Addison Shaw. Ms McWilliams supports removing the 40 hectare minimum lot size for subdivision in the coastal environment, with minimum lot sizes now defaulting to those of the underlying zone. Ms McWilliams also comments that the rules applying to rural lifestyle subdivision in the coastal environment will be the same as those of the underlying general rural zone, which was discussed under hearing 3. I note that Mr. Harrell addressed the matters raised by Ms. McWilliams in the Rural Zone Section 42A report and that hearing. I don't have any additional commentary to add on this matter and consider Mr. Harrell is best placed to answer questions on rural subdivision.
Given Mr. Harrell quite a bit of homework in that space.
Yes, yes, he's on it. On to 4.2 for Mr. McGuinness. Ms. Donaldson notes that the coastal environment report failed to address part of Mr. McGuinness's submission relating to subdivision in the settlement zone to be a controlled activity. Looking at the relief sought by Ms. Donaldson, I consider her suggestion to make subdivision of settlement zone sites within the coastal environment a restricted discretionary is the most appropriate option. Controlled activity status wouldn't enable councils to decline consent if effects were unacceptable, whereas restricted discretionary does. Relying on sub R12, which is subdivision of the coastal environment rule, instead of sub R2, which is subdivision within zones generally, is a more appropriate path, in my opinion, as the matters of control under sub R2 only relate to subdivision within the zones and doesn't have matters of discretion or control that relate to the identified overlays. Albeit there is a catch-all matter of control or discretion in case there are unidentified values such as landscape, heritage, ecological, sites of significance to Māori, or archaeological sites. However, sub R12, subdivision of the coastal environment, does include specific matters of discretion that are relevant to the coastal environment values, including coastal settlements.
Robin, through you.
Yes.
Just a question on paragraph 17. I thought you were missing a word initially. I thought you were saying that RDA is not the most appropriate option, but you're saying it is.
Yes.
But was Ms Donaldson at one stage suggesting controlled activity?
Yes, she originally sought controlled activity status,
Yes.
and then as alternative relief sought restricted discretionary status.
Or the settlement zone?
Correct. In the coastal environment, yes.
Yes. But we know that the status of activities, subdivision in the coastal will defer to the underlying zone.
Yes. Minimum lot sizes.
So is it different for the settlement zone?
No, so in effect, 2 subdivision rules would apply for subdivision in the coastal environment, and then you'd apply whatever, well, you can apply straight under R12, which doesn't have any minimum lot sizes.
Okay.
However, it does have matters of discretion that relate to the size and layout of sites and other matters. So the council would be able to look at the policies for that.
Yes, but it's R2 that in the settlement zone that has the minimum allotment size.
Yes.
Okay. And that's a sub R2, isn't it? So it will have a specified allotment size for all of the zones.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. What other zones are there in the coastal environment? Obviously, settlement and rural.
Settlement rural. I believe there's some natural open space for coastal significant natural areas and natural character areas.
And natural.
Other.
But predominantly rural or settlement.
Yes.
Open space and natural character is an overlay in itself, isn't it? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
On to paragraph 18. I agree that the deletion of the 40 hectare minimum lot size in the current clause C for sub R12 subdivision of the coastal environment means there is a lack of clarity about what minimum lot size does apply for subdivisions within the coastal environment. However, inserting the clause as she sought that all allotments created must comply with the minimum allotment size set out in sub S1, which has the list of the minimum lot sizes for each zone, would mean that the minimum lot size in the general rural zone would return to 40 hectares. This would go against the relief sought by other submitters who are seeking to use the range of rules available for subdivision in the general rural zone within the coastal environment. For example, sub R4, which is subdivision of land less than 4 or 6 hectares in the rural zone, or R5, which is subdivision of a surplus residential unit.
Yes.
In addition, sub R12 includes matters of discretion relating to coastal environment policies, subdivision design layout, and effects of non-compliance with any subdivision or overlay standard that is not met. I consider the matters of discretion allow council to consider the degree of non-compliance or compliance with minimum lot sizes in the underlying zone and make informed decisions on a case-by-case basis.
Can I just test that then? So got a property in the coastal environment, zone rural. It's less than 4 hectares. I can rely on the rural lifestyle. I can rely on the small lot subdivision pathway for existing titles at the time of the plan was notified, and I can create another allotment with, as long as I've got a balanced allotment of whatever it is, 2.5. Yep. Okay. As a controlled activity, but because it's in the coastal environment, it automatically becomes a restricted discretionary activity.
Yeah.
So it can, not a permitted baseline, but the controlled activity anticipates
That level.
that level of development
Mhm.
with perhaps some nuanced controls because it's in the coastal environment, and the matters of discretion would allow conditions to be placed on that, or at worst, if it was so obnoxious that it could be declined.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. On to then section 4.3, which is the Director General of Conservation. Regarding the comments about cross-references to relevant provisions in other chapters, I don't consider explicitly having cross-references is required, as this is explained in the How the Plan Works section of the proposed plan, and all relevant chapters apply district-wide from their location in the district-wide matters section of the plan and the locations of the relevant overlays in the GIS maps. So reading the plan as a whole, as should be the case, I consider this is sufficiently clear. Regarding the proposed amendments to policy P4 to improve its alignment with policy 11 of the NZCPS, I note that while the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity chapter is the primary chapter that seeks to protect Indigenous biodiversity, I acknowledge Ms. Shipper's point that the CPS provides specific direction about Indigenous biodiversity in the coastal context, which is a potential gap in the current policy framework. I've recommended a few changes to the wording proposed by Ms. Shipper to more closely align with the wording of policy 11 of the CPS, which she may wish to comment on, which is then under paragraph 20. Regarding the proposed amendments to matters of discretion in standards S1, S2, and S3, which is modification of vegetation, buildings and structures, and earthworks, she's asked to include consideration of the activity's effects on threatened Indigenous vegetation, Indigenous and migratory species and habitat, and coastal ecosystems. I agree this gives clear effect to policy 11 of the NZCPS to protect Indigenous biodiversity in the coastal environment. I therefore recommend these standards be amended to include these as matters of discretion.
Any further clarification questions?
On to section 4.4 for Eastleigh. Regarding the amendments to objective 02, I agree the amendments sought. I agree with the amendments sought for the reasons set out by Ms. Foster. However, regarding the change sought to restoring natural character where practicable, I consider this change broadens the policy and makes its intent less clear. For example, restoring degraded natural character. And the changes may imply that restoration should only be considered in all, that restoration should be considered in all circumstances and only discounted where it is not practicable. Accordingly, I don't recommend this change be made. Regarding the amendments to 03 to include where appropriate, reduced or not increased, I consider this introduces some uncertainty as to what appropriate circumstances are to reduce or not increase coastal hazard risk. This change would mean that this policy could be interpreted as being optional, whereas it needs to be very direct given the precautionary approach being applied to managing coastal hazards in lieu of detailed coastal hazard mapping being undertaken. Accordingly, I don't recommend this change be made either. Regarding policy P1, I particularly note Ms. Foster's comments about the Wellington RPS policy 4, stating district plans shall include policies and or rules to identify landward extent of the coastal environment using the following criteria. And that policy 4 of the RPS does give effect to objective 1 of this NZCPS in the Wellington context. While policy P1 generally gives effect to the Wellington RPS and the NZCPS, I agree the policy could be more closely aligned to the RPS for clarity and consistency, and have set out the changes under paragraph 24, which align with the criteria in the Wellington RPS. And we checked with Ms McRae as well, and this doesn't introduce any inconsistencies between how this has been mapped. Regarding Eastleigh's comments about the mapping of the coastal environment at Riversdale Beach, I will refer to the statement of Ms McRae, who will provide evidence after I've spoken. Regarding the amendments sought to policy P4, I agree with the amendments sought for the reasons set out by Ms Foster and recommend the policy be amended as shown under paragraph 26. Regarding Ms Foster's comments on policy P5 and rule subdivision R12, I agree that the most straightforward way to resolve the issue of the Riversdale Terraces subdivision not being within an existing coastal settlement under policy P5 would be to rezone this area to settlement zone. I can confirm that this submission point and this matter has been allocated to hearing stream Re13, which is the rezoning hearing where it will be considered further. Regarding the commentary on standard S3, which is buildings and structures, which limits buildings and structures to gross floor area of 200 square metres, I agree the standard is likely to be problematic where development is undertaken within existing coastal settlements. This is potentially inefficient as these buildings and structures are unlikely to have more than minor effects on character of the coastal environment, given they're within the context of the existing settlement. Depending on the evidence presented at the hearing regarding the coastal environment mapping, I would further consider Ms Foster's alternative suggestion of deleting the standard in consultation with Mr Horrell, given the standard also applies to many large rural sites within the coastal environment. Another alternative could be amend the standard to align with settlement zone standard S7, which states the maximum gross floor area of any single non-residential building or structure is 200 square metres. So, TBA.
Anything from panel on?
Cool. Section 4.5 for Meridian Energy. I recommended amending Objective O2 and Policy P4 as discussed previously, which is from Ms Foster as well. Regarding the amendments sought to Policy P6, I agree with the amendments sought by Meridian for the reasons set out by Ms Foster and recommend it be amended as set out under paragraph 30. On to section 4.6 for Transpower. For Objective 01, I agree with Ms McLeod that the amendments sought more closely align with the exact wording of the NZCPS. And however, I do not consider it as inappropriate for the district plan to be more aspirational than set out in Objective 1 of the NZCPS, given the importance of the qualities and values of the wide upper coastal environment to the community. Regarding the amendments for Objective 02, I agree that the addition protecting from inappropriate forms of subdivision, use and development generally aligns with the wording of Objective 2 of the NZCPS, except for forms of. However, inserting this wording, Clause A of Objective 02 would limit its application to only areas of outstanding, very high and high natural character, whereas Objective 2 of the NZCPS means it is applied to the entire natural character of the coastal environment and natural features and landscape values generally. Accordingly, I recommended amending Objective 02 as requested by Meridian. With regard to confining enhancement to natural, biological and physical processes, I refer to my comments on CE Objective 01 that I've just discussed on that matter. Regarding the amendment to Policy P2, I agree with the reasons set out by Ms McLeod to amend the chapeau of the policy to refer to inappropriate subdivision use and development. Regarding the potential to amend Policy P6 or the alternative relief sought to include a bespoke effects of the national grid policy in the network utilities chapter, I agree that addressing this in the network utilities topic will be clearer and more concise way, which we also discussed under the eco chapter previously. Regarding the relief sought for a new rule as shown under paragraph 37, I agree with the reasons given by Ms McLeod that the relief sought gives effect to the NPS electricity transmission while also giving effect to the direction of the NZCPS. I know that this rule would need an otherwise provided for clause added, as it would otherwise capture any earthworks, modification of Indigenous vegetation or buildings and structures as a discretionary activity, whether or not they would otherwise be permitted by Rule R1, R2 or R3. And therefore recommended it be inserted as paragraph 37. For completeness, I note that as drafted, the relief sought only applies to the construction of the national grid, not additions and alterations. I'm currently unsure whether this means additions or alterations that comply with the limits set out in R2 and R3 will be captured under those rules as restricted discretionary activities, or whether they are already provided for under the NES electricity transmission activities, which I invite Ms. McLeod to clarify when she speaks.
Thank you. She'll be speaking at 2:45 today. Anything further? We
Cool.
moving along?
Cool. Yeah, and just under section 5 again, under paragraph 39, I've recommended I've listed the changes recommended under the 42A report. Under paragraph 40, summarise the changes that we've discussed this morning. And then again, a brief section 32 AA assessment under paragraph 41. And just to summarise the main matters in contention, that will be the extent of alignment of the objectives and policies with high order documents, particularly the Wellington RPS, the NZCPS and the RMA, the extent to which to provide or exempt specific activities from rules and standards, and the extent of the coastal environment and flood protection area overlays.
Thank you. We don't have any questions.
One question is,
Sure.
I couldn't find it, I know it's somewhere. Distance from the high water mark that say with 220 kilometres long, how wide is it?
The coastal environment, Ms. McRae will be speaking to
Yeah.
How wide is it?
the coastal environment overlay. Varies.
It varies.
So there's not a definition that says from the high water mark to this point is the coastal.
No, that's not how it works.
So it's probably a good segue into
Okay.
Segue into where I'm going with.
Oh, so yeah. So hold that thought. It will be answered for you, and if it isn't, then
Sure. So I won't labour you with my qualifications and experience, but I will point out that I'm familiar with the Wairarapa coastal environment, and in particular the coastal environment at Riversdale, having been engaged as Masterton District Council's landscape expert in relation to a resource consultation by EAST to subdivide land at Riversdale Beach back in 2022. And I'm also familiar with the process to undertake the delineation of the coastal environment and evaluating natural character, having been a part of the study team for the Porirua Coastal Natural Character Assessment, which undertook this exercise for the Porirua City Council and Greater Wellington Regional Council. And this study used the same methodology as the Wairarapa Coastal Study, with pretty much all of the same study team except myself. And the only reason I wasn't involved was I was on maternity leave at the time. So yeah, I've undertaken a similar study for a different council, but the same methodology and the same study team apply. So yeah, familiar with the process. Yeah, to reassure you of that.
thank you for reiterating that. I think it's important for anyone watching the recordings and listening in now. Thank you.
So yeah, my response is really into that pre-circulated expert evidence provided by Christine Foster and John Hudson on behalf of East Leigh. So I've read the evidence in relation to the coastal environment chapter, and I acknowledge the corrections that have been provided in that evidence in respect of the original submission on these matters. The evidence on behalf of East Leigh is that the inland extent of the coastal environment is incorrect and it should not extend beyond the top of the coastal escarpment at Riversdale Beach. So the Wairarapa Coastal Study 2020 was carried out, and I'll just refer to it as the study. That's the background document which informs the location of the inland extent of the coastal environment in the proposed Wairarapa Combined District Plan. To provide background as to how the coastal environment was mapped, I'll provide some background relating to the skills and background of that study team and discuss the study methodology. So the study team included landscape architects and ecologists from Boffin-Miskell and experts from NIWA, including marine geologists. The inland extent of the coastal environment was mapped by this team through a series of workshops in accordance with the study methodology and with the agreement of the study team and representatives from South Wairarapa District Council, Carden District Council, Masterton District Council, Tararua District Council and Greater Wellington District Council. So they were all party to this mapping and participated in the workshops when it came to mapping that coastal environment line. So I've listed the study team there in the background. I won't go through that, but that's just there for your reference. The methodology for the study is described first on page 2 of the report and is set out below. I've underlined my emphasis. The first step of this assessment identifies and maps the extent of the coastal environment. And the coastal environment encompasses the coastal marine area, or CMA, extending out to the 12 nautical mile limit, and a relatively narrow fringe of coastal land above mean high water springs. The inland extent has been identified with guidance from NZCPS Policy 1.2 as generally being the part of the coast where coastal processes, influences or qualities are significant. So that's coastal processes, influences or qualities are not just present, but that they are significant. So that's the key thing. There's further detail in that methodology on pages 6 to 7 of the study, as well as a lot more detail on page 152 to 56 in Appendix 1, and I'll go on to discuss that a little bit further as I get into things. So the location of the inland extent at Riversdale, the evidence of East Lee by Mr. Hudson and Ms. Foster challenges the location of that inland extent in the plan. So in paragraph 5.7 of Ms. Foster's evidence, she asserts that, and I quote, irrelevant considerations have been applied in fixing the landward boundary of the coastal environment for Riversdale Beach. I disagree with this, and I also disagree that the extent of the coastal environment ceases beyond the top of the coastal escarpment, which is what's stated by Mr. Hudson in paragraph 7 of his evidence. And Mr. Hudson states it's not appropriate to apply a rule of thumb going back to the nearest ridge line when determining the inner boundary of the coastal environment, but it is necessary to apply the policy framework in every individual situation. The coastal environment exists only where coastal processes, influences, or qualities are significant. So I quite agree, and this is what has happened with the mapping of the coastal environment in the study. Paragraph 20 of his evidence, Mr. Hudson, I think there's some confusion around how he thinks this worked, but he sort of states that the Wairarapa the inland extent has been justified by describing the natural character of an area and then saying because this area has a certain natural character, then that is coastal environment. So that's not correct. Appendix 1 of the study describes the methodology with which the study was undertaken, which is further summarised by a diagram, and I say see image 1 below. So that's a little excerpt from the study that gives 5 kind of key steps for undertaking it. So the first stage was to define that inland extent of the coastal environment according to Policy 1 of the NZCPS. So that's looking at where those processes, influences or qualities are significant. And then once that inland extent was defined, marine and coastal terrestrial areas within the coastal environment were defined. And then the natural character values within each area were evaluated. So being at a district-wide scale, this initial exercise was carried out at a scale of 1 to 50,000. And then identified hotspots or potential components within each area that have the potential for high or greater natural character were then mapped at a more detailed scale of 1 to 10,000. So that's those areas that you are asking, the specific areas within the plan that have policies attached to them are then mapped at that more detailed scale. So this methodology is consistent with all of other coastal studies which have been carried out in the Wellington region as well. So Boffin-Miskell have done the same study for all of the local authorities in the Wellington region. So it's the same everywhere.
Consistency.
Consistency, yeah. So case law which relates to delineation of the coastal environment recognises that the coastal environment will vary from place to place, and it poses and I quote, "one of those theoretically difficult questions which will usually yield to the facts and a liberal dose of common sense." A more recent Environment Court decision observes that the purpose of identifying the coastal environment must drive any mapping methodology, and such mapping is an inherently reductive exercise, setting an apparently clear boundary when in the real world it's impossible to get an abstract definition which is capable of simple and ready application to any given situation. Paragraph 35 of his evidence, Mr. Hudson refers to a diagram which illustrates the interface between the coastal marine and coastal terrestrial environment, which is figure 14 in his evidence, and it's actually figure 2 on page 15 of the coastal study. And he's stating that the coastal environment is shown to finish at the top of the seaward cliff or escarpment, and if this information were applied to Riversdale, then the area inland from the edge of the coastal terrace at Riversdale would fall outside the coastal environment. So this view is a bit of a misinterpretation of the purpose of that diagram. So the purpose of that particular diagram was to provide a generic demonstration of the interface between the coastal marine and coastal terrestrial environment, and not to demonstrate the location of inland extent. So pages 154 to 56 of the coastal study contain a series of diagrams, which I think you've been slide, which illustrate the zones of significance within the coastal environment. So there's 5 diagrams which broadly represent the range of coastal landscape types found along the Wairarapa coastline. So I think you've got this one here.
Yeah.
There. There's 5 different, sort of broad brush speaking, these are the different types of coastal situation that we have at various places along in the Wairarapa coastal environment. And what you'll see is the definition of where that inland extent of the coastal environment is situated. It differs on each one. So it's not simply following a rule, such as the nearest ridgeline, or as somebody else said, a certain distance away from the mean high water spring or anything like that. It's been determined based on where those influences, qualities and processes are significant, and that varies depending on the landscape and depending on where you are in the coastal environment. So the coastal environment around Riversdale is represented by the East Coast Marine Terraces, which is labelled as figure 5 there. I've put it in my evidence as well, but it's figure 5 on your little handout. And that diagram illustrates the coastal environment extends around 500 metres inland from the edge of the coastal terrace. The diagram referred to by Mr. Hudson is more a representation of the coastal hills landscape type, which is figure 4, the one above it, where the coastal environment does terminate at the top of the first inland ridgeline. However, I guess this landscape type, and therefore the definition of the inland extent of the coastal environment, that's not applicable to Riversdale. It's a different coastal area. So I'll provide some further context as to why that area of coastal terrace has been included within the mapped coastal environment. So not just assuming that, the coastal environment stops here at the edge of the terrace, but it's including this area inland of it. So the reason why that was included, the eastern coastline of the Wairarapa coastal environment is highly exposed to coastal influences from the southwest and northeast, including exposed to open ocean swells and waves and vigorous storms. The coastline adjoins the Hikurangi subduction zone, a highly active tectonic subduction margin within the Pacific Ocean. As a result, there are several uplifted marine terraces with steep coastal escarpments and dunes present within the eastern coastline of the Wairarapa, which are highly influenced by the coastal marine environment and within which coastal influences, processes and qualities are significant. This includes the coastal terrestrial environment of Riversdale. As identified above, image 2, or that figure 5 that we were looking at here, outlines the delineation method for the coastal environment line in Riversdale. The approximately 500 metres setback from the edge of the marine terrace is to account for the strong coastal influences from the coastal marine environment, such as views of the ocean, sounds and smells of the sea, salt spray and salinity, and to encompass the highly legible uplifted marine terraces associated with the Hikurangi subduction zone and continental shelf in the adjoining coastal marine area. The delineation of this environment has particularly been informed by Policy 12C as being areas where coastal processes, influences or qualities are significant. Beyond this, the coastal context may continue, but the inland extent defines the extent to which coastal processes influence the qualities, not just present, but significant. So in my evidence, the image 4 just demonstrates the changes from the operative district plan to the proposed district plan coastal environment extent for Riversdale. So in some places it actually it actually reduces. So the proposed line has been drawn using updated methodologies and information available to encompass the coastal landforms within the terrestrial environment, adhering to the requirements of the NZCPS. The method applies also recognises that climate change and its implications, including sea level rise, will continue to influence the coastal environment. However, this has not influenced the delineation of the inland extent of the coastal environment for the purpose of the coastal study. So then my other attachment, figures 1 and 2, was just taken from some aerial photography that was shown at the time. Yeah, that's inland extent. The yellow line is where the inland extent lies in the proposed plan, and where the submitter is asserting it lies is, back here on the front of the terrace. So I guess it's like the idea that, you could be standing on that front of that terrace of the coastal environment, we just stop there and you can probably feel the wind and the salt spray and everything else hitting you in the face. So yeah, just demonstrating that and demonstrating that uplifted terrace landform, like that's actually a coastal, it's a coastal landform that's been uplifted from the sea, and it's really clear, really visible on those images. So yeah, in conclusion, the inland extent environment defined in the Wairarapa Coastal Study and carried through to the proposed district plan has been defined according to policy 1 of the NZCPS through a robust methodology that has included inputs from expert landscape architects, ecologists and coastal scientists, and the location of the coastal environment in the proposed plan should be upheld.
Thank you. No clarifications?
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. McRae. That's very clear. And can you just go to images 1 and 2 on the A3, the aerial photographs? And can I ask you to just point out particular features of that inland boundary that you think the panel might find of interest? Is there any?
Some of it will be, it's the terrace landform, I guess. So you can see the front of it there. That's the front of that uplifted marine terrace, and then it continues on inland. But I guess they said it's it's around 500 metres because that's where those coastal influences and processes are significant. So you're more likely to feel like you're in the coastal environment because you can see the sea, there's salt spray, there's salt-laden winds, there's coastal vegetation kind of present in some of those gullies, although I think some of those areas might be planted, but it's it's significant as opposed to beyond that where it's just, you might know that you're in the coast, but it's not particularly.
Here's like there's a road running in front of that uplifted terrace, which comes down from the top and runs down the front of that terrace and then sort of loops back again. Does the man-made features such as that have any impact on delineation of coastal areas?
So yes and no. I mean, the coastal environment is there irrespective of modification. So, but modification can have an influence on the inland extent. So there's probably not a good equivalent example in the Wairarapa, but in Porirua City, for example, the inland extent around the city centre there, the Onupoto of the harbour is highly modified. It's reclaimed land. The coastal influences probably only extends a street or two into this incredibly built up area. So in those types of areas, modification does have an influence on the inland extent of the coastal environment, but the level of modification that we've got here at Riversdale, such as a road and a few residential properties, that's not having an overall defining influence on where that inland extent sits, because those other coastal processes influence on quality, such as the landform and those other things that I've spoken about, I guess that's dominating. That's still significant. So we're saying it's in the coastal environment.
Thank you. What's happening to the topography as we run along that yellow line? Is it flattening off, or is it carrying on in an upward direction as you move away from the coast?
In some places, I think the terrace actually extends further inland, so it's staying flat, and it's not rising till further away. And in other places, you can kind of see, like I think in this area here, it does actually seem to rise immediately past it. So, yeah, again, it's not like a general rule of thumb. Sometimes some places in the coastal environment, there's really, when you're mapping ones like this, it's really obvious, because you can kind of go, well, once you get past the ridgeline, you don't get that coastal influence because you've got the way the landform rolls over. It's much more obvious where you're in the coastal environment and where you're not. And this is one of those places where it's not so obvious. And I guess it's more like, rather than having a line, it's more like a zone of transition, if you like, from being in the coastal environment to not being in it. But planning policy requires us that we have to draw a line.
Is that line, give or take, generally 500 metres back from mean high springs?
No.
What's the dimension there?
No, there's no specific dimension that's applied.
What is the actual, if we were to measure it, what dimension would we find generally?
I don't. You can't use a metric like that. That's what I've spent the past 10 minutes talking about. Is you can't use a
phrase that. I understand you can't use a metric. What if we were to measure the distance? What distance would we find that line to be?
That particular one at Riversdale?
Yes.
I think it's about 500 metres from the top of the escarpment, but then obviously you're including the area of the escarpment down to the mean high water spring. I don't know, you'd have to measure it. I'm not sure. It might be twice that distance.
But I'll be honest, the line just simply seems to follow the existing subdivision. You've blankly just gone, there's the subdivision, there's the land.
That's not what's happened, and I've just described.
Yeah,
That's what it looks like.
I've heard that. So can you just confirm whether you've actually visited the site or not?
Yes, I visited that site.
Thank you.
To just go back to my question, I appreciate, Ms. McRae, that you haven't simply applied a metric. I wasn't suggesting you had, but I was trying to understand what the metric, is through the bespoke delineation of the line. Does it, is it around 500 metres, or is it less or more?
It's more than 500 metres, because you're not just, when I said 500 metres, I was talking about it's around 500 metres from the top of the escarpment back. So obviously there's coastal environment included the other side of that from there to the mean high water spring.
Okay. Thank you.
Might be 800 metres, something like that.
Okay, right.
The furthest back part is over a kilometre, having built the road.
Just out of interest, do you happen to, you're involved in the subdivision consent. Can you point out for the panel where the Eastleigh site is?
So there's 3 different terraces. There's consented subdivision, I think, on both of these 2 areas, although not all built. And then there's another area that has subdivision consent that hasn't been given effect to on a more northern terrace.
Looking at it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The green patch looks like it's been sown in new grass. It's the future development area that they're talking about.
That's right.
The other 2 ridges were part of the original.
Thank you. That's all from me. Thank you.
You explore the
Just one.
No, I just got a comment. To me, and I know that area fairly well, it actually follows basically a ridgeline, because at the top of the subdivision on the left hand looking at, it drops right down into it.
It is that terrace
Yeah.
landform that's encompassing, and it kind of does show that actually in there's a little
Yeah.
like dip in the cross section. So there is a little landform definition, but in some places that's not there everywhere consistently all along. Yeah.
Could you just go through image 3 and 4 for me on page 5? If you, I'm struggling to sort of understand what you're trying to explain in those.
So image 3 is actually just a Google Earth shot that's similarly showing what this photo is showing in reality. This probably shows it better. And it's not reading particularly well, but you can see it's just trying to show from a different angle that uplifted marine terrace that backs Riversdale, but looking at it from a different angle with the line. And
Sorry, on that image 3, to the left of the pink line, you can see, as Ryan said, you can actually see down in a, yeah.
I'm really interested by that pink line though. After the Riversdale area, it comes right down towards the watermark and then goes back up again. And I'm wondering what's different there, having been along that coastline quite a lot, is it in my life, the sort of the land.
Yeah, there's not the same
difference there to.
It's not the same terrace landform. I'd have to go and look exactly, because I think that's actually a different area too within the study. Wait a minute, I might have the printed bit here. Let me double check what that specifically says.
It's farmland, it's farmed, but if the argument that you've used for the incorporates the Riversdale subdivision is there, then there's not a lot of difference in landscape really.
Or if it does drop off gullies behind.
I think that the answer will most likely be that it's a difference in landform on that particular part of it. So no, I haven't got that Whareami area printed out.
Yeah.
Rui subdivision is down that end.
Yeah, that's on the other side of that.
Narrow.
On the other side of the point there, though. Yeah. And those 2 little bays.
I mean, I guess that, yeah, all I can reiterate is that the purpose of defining that is where those coastal influences, qualities and processes are significant. So everywhere we've gone along and looked at drawing that line, it's been considering whether that's, where's the appropriate place to put that, considering those, and a lot of it is driven by coastal landform.
So this has been mapped. So can you remind me when the study was done to identify 2020, which was prior to, you said you'd worked on the consents in 2022? Was that?
So the original Riversdale subdivision, I think, was consented in something like 2010. The resource consent application I worked on in 2022 was looking at subdividing a further area of that part that had already been consented, the terraces that are already built on. I think they sought a further 21 lots, and I think they were granted 15 from memory.
The original one, I think, was 2004, if I remember.
Yeah, it was
built the roads. So.
Yeah.
So going then to image 4 and looking at the yellow lines, and that says to me that the subdivision that Eastleigh are talking about was predominantly in the coastal environment management area anyway.
Yes.
Correct? Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything? No? Thank you. Anything?
Clearly the panel will want to go out and visit. And we just look at, say, figure 1. Yeah. And it was, how can I just, there's 2 large trees that flat terrace behind the houses.
The ones at the sort of top of the road.
No, sorry. Trees standing together. and behind the second row of houses,
Oh, down the bottom.
down the bottom.
Oh, that's on the golf.
Yeah, and the golf course.
Yeah.
It's on the golf course.
Golf course. Sorry.
If the panel was standing on the road that runs in behind those,
Mm.
as opposed to standing up by the large shed or building right up the top.
So if you're standing down there, you're not going to see that line at the back because you're actually this is taken from the air.
Let me just finish my question.
Sorry.
And I was standing on the road behind the golf course, but
Mhm.
or they were standing up by the large implement shed at the very top of the line, front of that plantation forest. There's a long straight building.
Other side,
Other side.
side,
Yes.
further up.
Right at the back.
What would be the sensory differences that the person would observe in terms of coastal processes, in terms of smell, sight, salinity, those sort of things?
In terms of what's different from up here to down there.
Yes.
Well, if you're at the back of the golf course, you're possibly a little bit more sheltered from the wind because you're behind some of those houses in the front, whereas up here at the top of the coastal terrace, you're probably actually quite exposed to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the view would be different.
Yes, and you also see the sea. Yeah.
What about some of the other aspects that policy 2.1 refers to in terms of salinity, smell, just sight, those other
Yeah, I
sensory aspects?
suspect that you experience them in both locations, but yeah, depending on how strong the wind is that day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure, onshore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You still have the view that those sensory elements are still significant up by the implement shed
Yes.
and running along that line. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. If there's nothing else on the coastal environment, then I propose we move on to natural features and landscapes.
Of the three.
Oh, good idea.
Already.
Thank you. I will kick off from section 2 again to not repeat the introduction. So the purpose of the natural features and landscapes chapter is to identify areas of outstanding natural features and landscapes and areas of special amenity landscapes within the Wairarapa and provide for the maintenance or protection of their values. The chapter seeks to recognise and manage effects on these landscapes and their values by preventing subdivision, use and development from degrading or destroying their landscape values. Key changes between the operative and the proposed plan for this chapter are to have objectives, policies, rules and standards allowing for certain activities as being permitted. They are generally appropriate, such as existing land uses, conservation, natural hazard mitigation, and customary purposes. Where activities are not expected to have adverse effects on the values of outstanding natural features and landscapes. There is a revised schedule and mapping of the outstanding natural features and landscapes, which I'll shorten to ONFLs for the future, using the best practice criteria for identification and protection. And there is a schedule and mapping of special amenity landscapes, which is for information purposes and no specific rules apply. An overview of the chapter is in Appendix 2, which I will jump to. So the higher order context for this chapter is largely from the Wellington RPS and section 6B of the RMA. So again, I've set out where it gives effect to the relevant provisions of mostly the Wellington RPS but also sometimes the New Zealand CPS because it also includes those landscape values in there. In terms of the rules, it largely manages the activities that will have an effect on ONFLs, which is, again, earthworks, modifying Indigenous vegetation, and buildings and structures. So that's managed under Rule R1, which permits certain activities where they're appropriate or they comply with the maximum standards for those activities, which are in the standards, and goes up to restricted, discretionary, and then up to non-complying, depending on the thresholds of which these standards are exceeded. So for a restricted discretionary activity, for example, if you cannot meet the standards in S1 for earthworks, S2 for modifying Indigenous vegetation, or S3 for buildings and structures, there's a secondary threshold in the restricted discretionary activity. And then once those secondary thresholds are exceeded, then it goes to non-complying. There's also a specific rule for plantation forestry again, because that can adversely affect the Indigenous vegetation that's often there.
Any questions on Appendix 2?
But just a general question again, I'm just going back to the baseline of the operative plan. Did the operative plan contain scheduled natural features and landscapes?
It did.
Special amenity landscapes?
I don't believe so.
That's a no.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Has the spatial extent of the NFALs changed?
Yes, they have. They've been updated to reflect the latest study, which Boffa Miskell did as well, which is that one, Wairarapa Landscape Study 2010.
2010, yeah.
Yeah, which was widely consulted on at the time and did form the basis for a lot of the maps in the operative plan, but those have been kind of updated because this came out just after the.
Yes.
So I think the preliminary findings were available, but not the final.
There's both a schedule and mapping of ONFL in the proposed.
Yes, correct.
Yes. And the same with SALs.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And been no new NFALs identified in the proposed plan.
There have been. So most of them are recognised in Appendix 1.1 and 1.2 of the operative plan. There have been some additions and deletions. The additions include Puhaka Mount Bruce, the Hidden Lakes, Wairarapa Moana, and Lake Pauanui.
You just record that in the right of reply. It's probably in your 42.
It's it's on the last page.
Oh, is it?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Second to last page. Yeah, the last page of Appendix 2.
Oh, Appendix 2.
Yeah.
Under Schedule 7. Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. And essentially the objectives, policy, rules, standards have been tweaked.
Yeah, for the most part rolled over, but tweaked to give effect to national planning standards and to manage just a couple of.
But there's no rule for the SALs.
No, they're purely advisory.
Oh, there are some policies.
Yes, there are. So we have so policy P2 identify special amenity landscapes in accordance with Objective 18 and Policy 27 of the Wellington RPS. And then we have policy P6, which encourages awareness, maintenance and enhancement of ONFLs and special amenity landscapes. And and incentivizing support and incentivize voluntary protection of ONFLs, but that could equally support the same kind of things for SALs if landowners wish to do so.
Is there any operative policy provision for SALs?
No, I don't believe there is.
I'm sorry, no, I don't mean operative plan. I mean, so let me choose my words more carefully. With Indigenous biodiversity, there's policies for affecting IV in non-SNA areas. So, and basically there's blanket removals and presumably other activities that trigger consent, say in the rural zone, might trigger those policies. Is there a similar situation with special amenity landscapes?
Yes, that is the case. So so as you've mentioned, there's no specific rules applying to special amenity landscapes. And the effects on them are largely managed by the rules of the underlying zones, as you mentioned. The underlying zones generally provide for subdivision use and development at a level consistent with enhancing and maintaining the values of the special amenity landscapes. However, where resource consent is required for activities in the underlying zone, for example, rural, that's where the objectives and policies can be considered as part of the consenting process.
Okay, so I mean, I'm not seeing any particular policy here apart from support and increased public awareness. So for a resource consent for large-scale earthworks outside an OFNL, but within an SAL, you wouldn't be going to you wouldn't be relying on SAL policies for directing the outcome. You go to the zone policies, presumably.
Zone policies. You've also got Objective 02, which is just maintained and where practicable enhanced.
Okay. No, but there's no policy in the SALs to give effect to that objective, is there?
Just PSIC, which encourages awareness, maintenance, and enhancement.
Yeah. Okay.
It's light.
And but that's intentional?
It is intentional, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Moving on to section 3. We had 22 submissions and 9 further submissions on this topic. Where amendments were sought, it was generally to better align objectives and policies with higher order documents such as the Wellington RPS, NZCPS and the RMA, or to provide exemptions for activities from rules and standards. Submitters also sought specific properties be omitted from the spatial extent of the mapped ONFLs. I've read the evidence of Ms. Shipper on behalf of the Director General of Conservation, Ms. Foster and John Hudson on behalf of Eastleigh, Michelle Grinleton Hancock on behalf of Kiwi Rail, Emily Levinson on behalf of Horticulture New Zealand, Ms. Foster on behalf of Meridian Energy, and Ainsley McLeod on behalf of Transpower. For the Director General of Conservation, they were supportive of the changes made, so no further comment there. And on to section 4.2 is Eastleigh, which is the bulk of this introductory statement. They're seeking amendments to 02, which relates to special amenity landscapes, which we've just talked about, in policy P2. I note these have been identified as part of the Wide Upper Landscape Study, which Emma's just shown us, and based on the criteria of the Wellington RPS Objective 18 and policies 27 and 28, which I've replicated down there just for ease of reference. The main thing to note is identifying special amenity landscapes. It says that district plans may identify them. Where they are identified, it uses effectively the same criteria as identifying an ONFL. So it will have those same qualities, but not to an outstanding level. While I will defer to my colleague, Ms. McRae, as to the technical identification and delineation of SALs in respect of Riversdale, I will note that it is a non-regulatory layer in the plan and there's no specific rules applying. while the effects on special amenity landscapes are managed primarily by the rules of the underlying zones, which we've just discussed. I consider that as drafted, Objective O2 and Policy P2 accurately reflect the direction of the Wellington RPS. Whether they require amendment as set out in evidence will depend on presentations at the hearing and the identification and delineation of SALs, which we'll get into in Eastleigh when Eastleigh comes to speak. With regards to KiwiRail and Horticulture New Zealand, they are supportive of the changes made. On to Meridian, section 4.5. As discussed just earlier, in response to Eastleigh, I consider that Objective O2 and Policy P2 accurately reflect direction of the Wellington RPS with regard to special amenity landscapes. And we'll hear further on that as we progress through the hearing today and tomorrow. Regarding the amendments sought to Policy P4, I don't consider these aligned with the purpose of the policy and only managing coastal outstanding natural features and landscapes. The amendments that Meridian have sought relate to coastal natural features landscapes generally, not only those that are outstanding as are managed by this chapter. A policy managing effects on coastal natural features and landscapes would be better placed in the coastal environment chapter if it were to be included. And again, regarding the amendments sought by Transpower to policies P3 and P4, I agree that the alternative relief to include effects of the national grid policy and the network utilities chapters that we've discussed previously is the clearer and most concise way to give effect to the relief that she has sought.
Pause there for a moment and just ensure there aren't any questions or any clarifications required.
Section 5, additional matters. In my 42A report, I noted that site visits were being organised to assess the submissions from 3 submitters who are seeking amendments to the ONFL boundaries on their properties. And this will be reported on the hearing. Ms McRae was scheduling site visits to these properties at the time. And she will report back on her recommendations with respect to those properties, but I have summarised them under paragraph 20 there. But I'll let you speak to that so you can provide a bit more context as to those recommendations. Under section 6, I've listed the amendments recommended under the 42A report under paragraph 21. I've not recommended any changes at this stage in response to pre-circulated evidence. There was also a minor correction required to rule R1 because we inserted additional clauses in C and D, and then the references in the next down didn't match anymore. So I've included that correction. So to summarise the key matters that we'll discuss in the hearing today and tomorrow under paragraph 24 is the identification and delineation of special amenity landscapes, the extent of the alignment of the objectives and policies with higher order documents, the extent to which to provide for or exempt specific activities from rules and standards, and whether specific properties should be omitted from the spatial extent of mapped ONFLs.
Before we let Ms. McRae speak, is there anything anyone would like to clarify?
Thanks. So I'll just speak a little bit first about this Wairarapa landscape study. So that formed the background to the NFL chapter. And this particular part of it's the evaluation. So refer to the evaluation, which means it's document. That was prepared by Boffa-Miskell, and it involved the input of a steering group, which comprised of members of the 4 Wairarapa councils, iwi and federated farmers. I was not involved with the preparation of this evaluation, and as it was undertaken some 14 years previously, the Boffa-Miskell staff members who were involved at the time have since left the company or retired. So I've reviewed the evaluation itself along with the background files that were kept from the time of the kind of extensive consultation that was undertaken for that piece of work. And I've also spoken to a steering group member or the ex-Boffa School staff member or semi-retired staff member who worked on this at the time to kind of get some insights from him as to some of the background that wasn't entirely clear when I was reading the files. So I guess I'm taking that into account and responding to the submissions. So principally there's 3 submitters who it was identified needed sort of further engagement to be able to properly address their responses. And then I've also got a response to that pre-circulated expert evidence again from Christine Foster and John Hudson on for Eastleigh. So the 3 landscape matters raised in submissions to the NFL 3, and they're all to do with ONFLs. So the first ones were Paula Gillett and Jane Donald submitted S211, and that was with regard to ONFL 8, the Wairarapa Moana. So they sought to have that overlay removed from their property at 379 Diversion Road, Featherston. And they were concerned the effect the overlay might have on everyday farming operations. So we undertook a site visit to that property on the 21st of November and looked at the boundaries that had been mapped on the ONFL within the property. And the recommendation there is that the areas outlined in red on my Appendix 1 in relation to this one, this graphic attachment, and this plan here, these red areas that are highlighted, so the green is what's in the proposed plan, and the red areas are recommended to be excluded from the ONFL boundaries as they're either pasture areas or sort of wetland areas, but they've got a predominance of exotic vegetation, mainly willow and blackberry, so they're not actually kind of native vegetation, and a lot of them are not really contiguous with wider ONFL, particularly that area. Some of those areas up the top are separated by a spillway from the main area of the stream. So that, they're not really contiguous, and the description for the Wairarapa ONFL indicates that the wetland areas that are included are ones that have a high degree of naturalness, and these ones, they're not, but blackberry and things like that. So they don't have that high degree of naturalness that other Indigenous wetland remnants have that are included with the ONFL. So there's an area like this area to the south here does, like that has got really high, natural values, and the landowners have undertaken a lot of planting. They've done a great deal of work there. It's actually really amazing what they're doing within that property. So while also there, we discussed with them proposed provisions in the plan, and that they would that ONL layer doesn't really affect everyday farming operations. A summary of the proposed provisions was provided for them, and we had a discussion about that too. So the recommendation for that one is those areas highlighted in red are removed from the ONL and the boundaries adjusted. So that's the first one. The second one is Sean Draper, submitted S63, ONFL 9, Ngā Waka o Kupe. So this submitter sought to have the boundary of ONFL 9, Ngā Waka o Kupe, removed from within their property. They agree with the existing extent of the Ngā Waka o Kupe as shown in the operative district plan, but don't agree with the proposed extension of this area, in particular the extension of it to the summit known as Windy Peak. So a meeting was held with that submitter on the 21st of November, and it was explained, the reason for that ONFL extension that had been revised to extend beyond the existing ONL boundary at both the northern and southern ends, in both cases to acknowledge the landscape context. The larger ONL area recognises the integrity of the wider ridgetops and skyline beyond that existing area. Windy Peak, that forms the northern extent of Ngā Waka o Kupe ONFL, provides an important part of the landscape context. To restrict the ONFL to just the very edges of this upturned Waka landform would ignore this context and relationship of the Waka with its environs. So the Windy Peak is sometimes referred to as the fourth canoe. I guess we recognise Ngā Waka o Kupe as called Three Canoes, and this is recognised through historical research that was undertaken during the development of the landscape evaluation, found that continuity between Ngā Waka o Kupe and Windy Peak is important, and that visually the two landforms belong as one entity. The background to this decision was also provided in a letter and information to the submitter way back 28th of September 2011, which was when that extension of the ONL was first mooted and engagement with affected parties was undertaken. So there's quite a long history there of, adding that and then consulting with the affected parties at the time. That's all been recorded. So this decision to extend that ONFL was made by the Wairarapa Landscape Study Steering Group in 2011. And
Can I just interrupt you there? When the first consultation with the Drapers was started in 2011, what was their response?
I believe he was opposed to it.
So it's been consistent
Yes.
for 10 years, 13 years. Okay.
So the steering group included consultant landscape architects from Bothamiscal, officers from Greater Wellington Regional Council, Masterton District Council, Carterton District Council, South Wairarapa, Federated Farmers, Rangatane o Wairarapa, and Ngāti Kahununu ki Wairarapa. The names of the individuals involved are actually recorded, I think, just inside the front cover of the study as well. So to give some context, I've provided in figure 2 of my attachment photograph. It's draped with the existing and proposed ONFL boundaries. And I think I talk about this a little bit more when I talk about the reason behind, like why some of the ONFLs were revised. Essentially, in undertaking the evaluation, there were some of the 4 councils, there were some that had ONLs mapped, some didn't. And when it was looked at it, they weren't all, I guess, mapped using a consistent criteria and a consistent method. So this is what the study sought to do. It sought to kind of look at the areas, define, where the values are. Again, there's like a methodology in the appendix for how that was kind of carried out, and there was like extensive public consultation that was undertaken at the time. So they identified ONFLs. There were, I think there's dates in here, the consultation programs, there were like 4 different public meetings that were held that people could turn up, and, people had their say on these extended areas at that time, just to understand that context. But figure 2 illustrates the red is the operational ONL boundary, so it encompasses those 3 landforms. The proposed encompasses this 4th landform, and the thin white line there you can see is the property boundary. So what the submitter is seeking to have excluded is everything between the white boundary and the yellow boundary on the left. And I guess you can kind of see the continuity of that 4th landform, and that excluding that from it would just not really be consistent when you're trying to encompass a landform. Taking that away, I guess, would sever that continuity of the landform of Windy Peak, which is being recognised by that ONFL boundary. So it's logical that it includes that top, but also the landform leading up to the peak. So essentially, his property boundary almost runs up to the top of the peak. So if you were to take that area out, it's like you'd be including the top of it on one side, but not the other, if that makes sense, which doesn't seem consistent, unfortunately. We were talking about an area that was lower down at the bottom of it, then I could see much more argument for why you want to take it out, but it's literally like it would literally be putting in one side of the peak, but not the other side. So removal of that area would be incongruous with the wider recognised landform of Ngā Waka o Kupe. So I don't recommend any further revision there.
Thank you.
Did the landowner to the south of the Drapers boundary, did they submit on this, or did they have any comment on the extension of the boundary?
Not through the proposed plan. This was the only one received on this ONL.
So we take it as accepted by them. Okay.
Effectively, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. Just going back to looking at the red line, where the red line's just before the 4th peak, underneath there in the yellow, there's a dip in the contour line, is that following down a gully and up another ridge?
I believe so, yeah, because when you look at it plan, sorry, I'll just try and find the correct page of the study. I should have had that open already. Sorry, you haven't got this, but I'll probably show you. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to see on here, but there's a yellow line that's the proposed. I can bring it over and show you.
The cables.
Sorry about this. The yellow is the existing and the red is the proposed, and then where you can see the line, I think it's where it's coming.
Down here.
Yeah, coming through there. So it looks, when you look at it on a map, it
Should be having, the stuff should be on the screen so that anyone online can see it. So
You can try and.
for the future presentations.
Yeah, understand it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Awaka?
Okay.
Oh.
Paragraph 15.
Sure. Yeah, so the third one, Tim Druziniak, submitted 146, and that was in relation to ONFL 14 Ruakokotuna. So this submission was to exclude the property at 765 Haurangi Road from the ONL overlay. And a site visit was arranged with the submitter, but it was withdrawn from the day before. So 2 telephone conversations were had with him. I spoke to him on the 14th and the 20th of November, and we discussed the provisions in the proposed plan in relation to ONFLs. And he had particular concerns that identifying the ONFL would allow public access to his property. He was concerned about people basically going onto the property and falling down those holes and things. And obviously I explained that's not the purpose of it. The purpose of it, it doesn't create public access over private land. It's to identify landscape values and protect them from, inappropriate use and development. So we had that discussion. He also had questions about what such an overlay would mean if you were wanting to do certain activities like building a wind farm or undertaking forestry. So answers to these questions were supplied by the planning team in an email to him on the 19th of November 2024. So following the answering of these questions, he stated that he was in speaking to him, he said, I'm less concerned about this, although he sort of then said, there's still some bits of it that I don't agree with, although I couldn't get him to be specific as to which bits he didn't agree with or where those areas were. So, for your information, for context, in case this comes up again somehow, that Ruakokotuna chasm was included as an existing ONFL in the operative plan. And the boundaries of it were reviewed during the process of preparing the landscape evaluation, upon which the new boundaries are based. So page 9 of the evaluation notes that the boundaries of existing ONFLs were reviewed, and this is what I spoke about earlier, as it wasn't entirely clear how existing ONLs and ONFs were identified, assessed or delineated in the previous district plans for Masterton, Casterton and South Wairarapa, given that these were rolled over. So it was going back and looking at all those areas again, and the combined district plan recognising the need for a comprehensive and comparative assessment, and that's what the evaluation supplies. So the extension of that Ruakokotuna chasm ONFL from its original boundaries, it resulted from the identification of other landscape features in the immediate area of the chasm, including Haurangi Bluff, the Ruakokotuna River, Ahuni Chasm and Falcon Rock. In earlier drafts of the evaluation, these areas, they were attempted to kind of map them separately, and then there was the chasm as one area, and then these other features as another area called the Ruakokotuna precinct. However, due to their proximity and kind of continuity, it became kind of clear it really was one landscape, and it made sense to map it as one landscape, and that was a decision that was made by the steering group. to include those features all together as one area. So we're not recommending any further revision to the boundary there.
Any questions?
Have we got a copy of the response, the minute that was sent about concerns about forestry, and I haven't seen it. It doesn't mean we haven't got it, but
We emailed the submittees. Did you send it from there?
we'll probably
Do you-
get some of the other questions on.
Does just mean what you sent to him on the 19th of November? That
Yeah,
email that you sent to him
Is that the one you at the?
Yeah, you said
in the footnote?
you said that you responded to his queries about whether it would inhibit him for
Email
wind
from-
farms and
Yeah.
friends on.
His more concern was that he didn't want a wind farm, and so I was saying, well, it doesn't prevent you from having a wind farm, but it would make it a hang of a lot more challenging to build a wind farm on something that was identified as an ONFL, because you'd need to show that you were, that you weren't having adverse effects on those landscape values that it was being identified for. So it was not for the reason.
So his was not, I want to have it.
It was, I don't want to have it. Yeah.
Okay, so
So he was quite.
sorry to carry on with my question. It raises the question that, particularly with the Druzy Annex in the Awaka area, I'm assuming that some of these rules would stop us having the same sort of development that has occurred on the Ruahine Ranges outside Palmerston North.
So
I'm not sure we'd be that popular to have all over these.
No, I mean, like such an overlay doesn't prevent you from having a wind farm.
need consent.
Yeah, you'd need consent. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's that extra layer of
It's
protection.
an extra layer of protection.
So it'd be much harder. Yes.
So the bar is set higher to do that than if it would be otherwise.
We move along on your report then, please.
Sure. So coming down to responding to that pre-circulated expert evidence from Christine Foster and John Hudson for East Leigh. So I've read that evidence. I acknowledge the two corrections they've provided in respect to the original submission. So the evidence on behalf of East Leigh in relation to this is that the settlement of Riversdale Beach, including the area known as Riversdale Terraces, should be excluded from the Wairarapa Coast Special Amenity Landscape. So Ms Foster and Ms Hudson assert that the qualities and values for the SAL as described in Schedule 8 for SAL 1 are not present at Riversdale. In her evidence at paragraph 1510, Ms Foster states that most of the values I've heard described for the settlement of Riversdale do not align with natural science values described in the schedule for SAL 1. The only listed values for SAL 1 that align with what I've heard previously are the shared and recognised values, that is tangata whenua settlement and recreation destination. These last two values are distinctly different for the natural and sensory values. The implication of this is that Ms Foster believes that shared and recognised values should not count towards the value of a landscape as a special amenity landscape, and only natural environment values should be considered in mapping such areas. So this isn't the case. Shared and recognised values can also form a part of the evaluation of special amenity landscapes, and I'll discuss this matter further. Mr Hudson states in his evidence at paragraph 40 that special amenity landscapes should refer to broader landscapes where natural character is dominant. He points out that policy 27B of Wellington Regional Policy Statement anticipates there may be modified landscapes that qualify as special amenity landscapes, but in his words, to qualify, they need to have exceptional or out of the ordinary qualities. So there's two matters at play here. One is that special amenity landscapes do not necessarily relate to the presence of natural character. In this sense, I think Mr Hudson might be confusing natural character with the idea of naturalness. So Te Tangiata Manu Aotearoa Landscape Assessment Guidelines defines the difference between natural character and naturalness on page 205, and that's in my footnote. So the guidelines adopt the interpretation that natural character is a type of character, the distinct combination of an area's natural characteristics and qualities, and that naturalness is one attribute of that natural character. So I basically agree with that distinction, and what I would say is that special amenity landscapes, they could include areas of both natural character and areas of naturalness, and indeed the proposed Wairarapa special amenity landscape has both. The second matter relates to the definition of what can be considered a special amenity landscape and what it may encompass. So the Wairarapa Coast Special Amenity Landscape is identified in the Wairarapa Landscape Study 2010 evaluation, and that forms the background to these areas as we've discussed. So the study was initiated to assist in developing planning measures for managing landscape change in the Wairarapa district. And the regional policy statement for the Wellington region allows district plans to identify significant amenity landscapes under Policy 27. And it provides a list of 12 criteria to be used in Policy 26. The RPS describes significant amenity landscapes as those landscapes that are either predominantly natural landscapes that are special, but not as exceptional as an outstanding natural landscape, or they could be landscapes that, despite modification, are still considered special or exceptional due to aesthetic, cultural, or other relevant factors. So the evaluation on page 14 notes that SAL areas on the coast are of the same extent as the CEMA, the Coastal Environment Management Areas, excluding the ONFL areas, and as such have a higher level of protection than the general rural areas that underlie the remaining SALs. The mapping of that coastal environment management area was undertaken as part of the Wairarapa Coastal Strategy in 2002, and that involved collating existing information on landscape values of the Wairarapa coastline, identifying the importance and prioritising their significance. The coastline was divided into coastal units, and natural character values and landscape values for each unit were evaluated. And the extent of coastal units mapped during the study became what was the CEMA boundary in the operative plan. Extensive fieldwork was undertaken, often by foot, to map those boundaries. So the methodology for undertaking the evaluation also describes that there were thresholds set for sites to qualify as either an outstanding natural feature and landscape or a significant amenity landscape. So a full methodology for undertaking the evaluation is in Appendix A. Within this, there's a brief summary of some of the consultation undertaken to identify important landscapes within the Wairarapa. And I just note that the entire Wairarapa coastline as having special values was raised 11 times across 3 public meetings that were held at the time of doing the study. The evaluation identifies that the Wairarapa Coast SAL has high natural science values, high sensory values, and high shared and recognised values. To qualify as a special amenity landscape, the landscape must score high in the sensory values category and at least high in one other value. So in the case of the Wairarapa Coast SAL, it actually scores high in all 3 categories. An important part of defining areas which qualify as outstanding natural landscapes and special amenity landscapes is their scale, and that they must be of such a scale as to be considered a landscape. So that's obviously the case for the Wairarapa Coast SAL. It's pretty large and it covers, the coastline. Necessarily, when considering an area at a landscape scale, it might be that there are small areas within that perhaps on their own would not qualify as outstanding or having special amenity, but nevertheless contribute to this as part of the wider landscape. This is considered the case in relation to the small settlements along the Wairarapa coast contained within the Wairarapa Coast Special Amenity Landscape. While, there might be areas of modification within the landscape, they form an important part of the character of the coastal landscape. And it's my view that such settlements cannot be viewed as kind of separate from it, and they should be retained as part of the SAL. Including kind of modified areas within SALs is consistent with the explanation of Policy 27 in the RPS. And I've just provided that there in paragraph 27. Special amenity landscapes, when compared to outstanding natural landscapes, will have, when assessed under the factors listed in Policy 25, so they can either be A, highly valued but not clearly exceptional values in an area where the natural components or character dominate, or B, highly valued, including exceptional landscape values in an area where the modification of landscape by human activity is a dominant influence on landscape character. I'd actually say that the Wairarapa coast probably has areas of both A and B, depending on where you are along that coast. So yeah, I definitely think it qualifies. The inclusion of Riversdale and other coastal settlements within the Wairarapa Coast Special Amenity Landscape is consistent with point B, where the landscape is highly valued, as demonstrated by the high natural science values, sensory values, and shared and recognised values identified in the evaluation. But there's areas of modification by human activity. And even within those areas of modification, they possess those shared and recognised values which contribute towards the range of high landscape values which justify the inclusion of that area. Mr. Hudson suggests an alternative wording to policy NFLP2. I don't agree with that because, as discussed, the values of the special amenity landscapes, they go beyond natural and sensory values. But I support the suggested wording change to this policies provided in the 42A, which updates NFLP2 to include reference to specifically to those natural science, sensory and shared and recognised values which make landscapes. So in conclusion, the inclusion of the Riversdale settlement and terraces within the proposed SAL is justified due to their setting as part of the wider landscape and their shared and recognised values which form a part of the overall values of the SAL. The inclusion of these areas is also consistent with the higher order policy for the inclusion of special amenity landscapes as outlined in the Wellington RPS.
Clarification questions from anyone?
Just one from me, and it's both Wheatley and Ms. McRae. It would be useful if the panel could have a map or a plan for the Riversdale area showing zoning, the coastal environment overlay, and the SAL overlay.
I could bring that up on the
I'm just conscious of time.
yes.
Yeah.
Of time, we're running
True.
a bit late, but
True.
if we could have that part of the writer reply, that would be useful.
Sure. Map of overlays.
Thank you, Robin.
Nothing else. I propose lunch is here, that we break now for lunch. You. Close to 12:30. We reconvene at 1 p.m. Would you be able to let our submitters know we are running slightly behind schedule? We have two more topics. Mr. Goldsmith, we have natural character and public access. How long do you think?
As long as the public access, I think, will be quite short.
Yeah.
Character maybe a little bit longer, but
Maybe half an hour.
Yeah, probably about half an hour,
and I'll try and keep it concise.
Yes.
Fabulous. Thank you. So with that, we will conclude part 2 of today and we will break for lunch.
Yeah.